And we are recording.
Okay.
Okay, folks, welcome. This is our second webinar on the COVID-19 crisis. We're very glad you could join us today. We are going to talk about three major themes today. We're going to talk about the fact that, and continue talking about how the markets are collapsing. We're going to have some firsthand information from participants in the market about how procurement markets for COVID-19 supplies are collapsing. Traditional means of competition and transparency are really not being used at all. And that's raising a second set of problems, which are there are new threats regarding fraud in this marketplace. We're going to be discussing that, and that's probably the most serious threat right now because of the health threat that fraudulent goods pose around the world. And the third thing we're going to be talking about today is international cooperation. As supplies are aggregated by governments responding to the pandemic in those governments, there'll be a second phase after the pandemic begins to wane in some countries, the second phase of cooperation, necessary cooperation between countries to redistribute those very valuable supplies around the world. And we're going to start talking about that second phase today as well. The chat room is open. Please feel free to ask questions in chat as we go. And we will also be having questions and answers from the audience towards the end of the session. A recording of the session will be posted in the program page of publicprocurementinternational.com. Our speakers today include Laurence Folio-Lalio, who is joining us from Dakar in Senegal, David Drapkin, who's the chair of the Procurement Roundtable, which is a group of senior procurement former officials and senior industry persons in the United States. John Luigi Albano from CONSIP in Italy will be joining us shortly. Bill Kovacic, who's a professor with me at George Washington University. He's a former chair at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. He's a very respected competition lawyer and professor. Ben Caberna, who is from EasyBuy. Ben's going to be talking about what's happening in the marketplace. He's located in Ohio, here in the United States. We have Cao Fuguo from the Law School of the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing. We're very glad to have him join us. He should be joining us shortly. And Simon Ebenet from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He'll be talking about trade issues. We'll have a special guest in the Q&A, Benedetta Audio, who's a lawyer at UNOPS. This is a map of where the contingent stands today. And we have here, just to give you perspective on where we are in the United States, it's becoming apparent in the United States that we're going to have a projected 100 to 240,000 deaths here in the United States. The United States is, as you can see from the map, is the center of the contagion, and a lot of the public policy issues we'll be discussing today have a direct relationship to what we're doing. Laurence is going to be talking about some emergency legislation and emerging international competition for very precious supplies. John Luigi Albano will be talking about emergency contracting in Italy. Bill Kovacic will be talking about competition law issues. Ben, as I said, will be talking about market conditions. Cao Fuguo will be talking about China's strategy. Simon Ebenet will be talking about trade barriers. He'll be drawing on a report that he published that is on our resources page, our COVID-19 resources page. And Benedetta Audio will be talking about payment and delivery issues that are being faced by UNOPS. David Drapkin will be talking about an important provision in our CARES Act. The CARES Act was signed by by President Trump on Friday, became law. The CARES Act is a $2.2 trillion relief bill, and it includes an important provision, Section 3610, which is a provision targeted at contractors to allow contractors financial recovery during the COVID-19 crisis. With that, I'll turn it over to Laurence.
Hi, good afternoon. And many thanks to Professor Hukins for inviting me in this worldwide event. I would like to address two international topics. The first is the ongoing competition among states and procuring entities. We can now notice a specific emergency market or reversed or upside down markets driven by vendors and intermediaries, where sometimes even direct contracting procedures and procurement rules are set aside, replaced by emergency auctions and aggressive spontaneous offers. The EU has just adopted a procurement guidance which underscores the freedom of negotiations given to 250,000 EU procuring entities for the COVID contracts. I call them COVID contracts. This creates fierce competition among countries and even among contracting authorities within countries, with sometimes diversion of supply. Thus, the lack of coordination among procuring entities and among countries fuels this chaotic situation. Under such circumstances, transparency and integrity of COVID contracts are at risk. And this is my second point. For American folks, it may be surprising, but in many countries, direct contracting, even more under emergency procedures, is understood as being exempted from any transparency requirements. Under the EU framework, post-award notices are only mandatory above the EU thresholds and not in the case of call-off under framework contracts or IDIQ. Below the EU thresholds, member states are free to require or not such post-publicity. This issue could be even more dangerous in other parts of the world with emergency procurement rules without a clear definition of the emergency concept itself, without clear identification of contracting entities entitled to use exceptional procedures, and without transparency requirements. So we begin to see countries enacting dedicated emergency laws excluding COVID contracts from the scope of their procurement rules. I just gave the example of Senegal, but there are others. So we should be attentive. Other African countries or not are going into this direction. The procurement community, including MDBs, multilateral development banks, should advocate for minimal transparency requirements in COVID-related contracts. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer your question later on.
Thank you, Laurence. Gianluigi, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? I think yes, I always experience problems with the sound. I think that the ward doesn't want to hear from me today.
We do, Gianluigi.
My suspicion. I wish I could have put some of the, the antiques here behind it, but I just a white wall, which is sort of a metaphor what's happening in Italy right now. I mean, we're experiencing to some extent to an extreme level of density, different phases of the way procurement could be or can be carried out under emergency circumstances. Now, Laurence has magnificently fleshed out all the potential dangers ahead of us in terms of the temptation of loosening the rules in order to accommodate for easier ways of carrying out procurement in this under extreme urgent circumstances. But the point is, we are already beyond that level. I mean, it's the rule of law in itself which has been breached internationally. I mean, and I think because of the fact that Italy was struck soon after, massively soon after China, we're sort of experiencing exactly what's happening below the table, which is very simply something that Laurence has already pointed out. That I mean, a month ago, we showed that in fact a proper procurement procedure could be conducted, even at the very early stages of an emergency situation. We carried out within 72 hours, that I know for American ears may sound a normal time, but for continental, especially for Italian ears, it's an extremely short time frame to conduct a negotiated procedure without publication, which is now recognized by the Commission in the document, in the communication that Laurence was mentioning, as one of the sort of proper ways of carrying out procurement. And mind you, there is a very, to me, potentially dangerous comment that the Commission makes by saying, oh, by adopting these, it turns out that basically you're replicating a direct award. This is a big lie, a big lie. And what I'm going to show in the sort of short paper I'm preparing right now, as a way of leaving, you know, a kind of a direct experience of what's happening, we were able to carry out the negotiated procedure without publication by having tens of offers, by having proper competition, having prices below even, you know, what at that time used to be the average market prices. So it could be done. Now, a month have passed, and a month under extreme circumstances is like you know, 10 years. So now the problem is not conducting proper procurement anymore. As Laurence was saying, now the point is exactly how to refrain states, regions, and even continents to fight against each other in order to get the hands on existing stocks and sort of planning or booking production plans in the months to come. So what's happening right now is the following. We started a month ago with what we thought at that time to be a proper procurement approach, even under extreme circumstances. Now, what's happened is that it's not enough. What we found on the market is not enough. So now everybody is free, regions, municipalities, health authorities, to look for masks and ventilators, just to name the most commonly used items right now, by themselves. And so what's happened is different layers of government are competing among each other. And this is happening in Italy, but it's going to happen between France and Italy, between Italy and Germany. But by the way, it's happening. It started happening a month ago when we were looking. We basically asked awardees, you know, suppliers to basically commit to their production plans and to their delivery plans, and they immediately responded that all stocks had been blocked by different European member states there because there were bans to export those items, not to mention frozen batches of ventilators in Brazil and Singapore or in a lot of other regions of the world. So in spite of rules being in place and in defending or should be defending the rules of law, the rule of law internationally, what's happening, we're witnessing, and that I would say it's well beyond procurement. We're observing the dramatic crumbling of international trade agreements, which is very striking in Europe because we're supposed to have a European common market, and that is nowadays concretely seems to be a big lie. We're observing this at more international level with all those items blocked. So what happens is that these affect barriers and you know, bans to export will not make anything else than exacerbating the competition among buyers, because you know there will be a lower stock available, and so what's been happening and what's happening in order to unlock those frozen items, many states have decided to use informal strategies, which is very simply to send intermediaries, send people with suitcases packed with dollars, yens, or euros to producers in order to book those items. So it seems to me extremely sad that you know, as a procurement sort of specialist and as a citizen of the EU, to observe that it took the European Commission almost 2 months to step in, but not to step in, yes, to step in with a joint procurement agreement, which is going to satisfy maybe 0.3% of the overall needs in Europe, but not to come with, not to, you know, come up with a solution, which is basically that international coordination is needed And I wonder whether, with respect to what I told you, friends and colleagues, and many participants a week ago, it's not time either for multilateral international banks or in general international organization to become sort of coordinating spots or coordinating organization in order to learn very quickly from our mistakes and then implement coordinated strategies, especially in those countries, such as developing countries, in which presumably there are not centralized procurement agencies with a little bit of expertise, which are in a position, at least potentially, to take care of this business. And so I'll stop here and I'll take any question. Thank you very much for your attention.
So Gianluigi, two quick questions for you. One is, in terms of enforcement priorities, what I think I hear you saying, and tell me if you agree, is that there are tiers. The highest tier is the question of fraud in delivery of supplies. That's the most important enforcement question. The next tier down may be issues of competition, but certainly there are those are much less important than the issues of fraud. Do you concur with that?
I perfectly agree with you. Now, with respect to a week ago, with respect to 2 weeks ago, I think that the first tier is becoming really the big urgency right now.
And in terms of buyer cooperation across borders in order to aggregate demand, what would your suggestion be?
I mean, as I said, I think that we already reached a stage where coordination, local coordination, even if we could agree in Italy on coordinating the big buyers like central procurement entities at the national level, at the regional level, this would not be enough. I would say that even if we could really carry out procurement processes in Brussels, as a metaphor, like the sort of capital, so one purchasing point on behalf of all member states, this would not be enough. We're not competing with the United States. We're competing with our countries outside of the EU. So the point is, miscoordination is not necessarily harmful because of prices, but because it triggers illegal, unlawful behavior at international level. That's the point. This is why I'm calling for an urgent look at what's happening. We're observing a completely breakdown of all, de facto, I'm not saying on paper, de facto of all the agreements it took us 50 years to write on paper, okay? That's maybe we're living under extreme stress, I would say, Chris. So maybe we're becoming increasingly hour after hour more and more pessimistic. But what we're observing and what we hear informally from intermediaries, brokers, is that there is basically no rule whatsoever in place. And the only rule that is really reigning this story is whoever gets most cash in the suitcases. Okay, as simple as that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bill, would you like to talk about competition issues?
Yes, Chris, thank you. Really 3 points. One, dealing with competition law. Second, the related question of excessive pricing, price gouging, and a word about fraud too. Competition authorities are basically issuing 2 types of messages about cooperation among suppliers in the face of the crisis. The first message is encouraging, which is, we will give you expedited procedures to give you advice about when cooperation is suitable. In general, cooperation is thought to be suitable to deal with the crisis. That is, this isn't an omnibus declaration that you can cooperate on all matters. Crisis-related matters involving health, safety, prices, and quality are acceptable. And the guidance mechanisms are designed to provide relatively quick advice about what kinds of arrangements are suitable. The resources page includes a representative statement of this kind from the U.S. Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission that lays out the approach they're taking to provide guidance about when arrangements would be suitable. So the first message is one to promote a degree of certainty that specific arrangements would be acceptable. The second message, though, is aggressive, a commitment to use existing competition rules in a forceful way to attack those who use the crisis as an excuse to form cartel arrangements. And the public agencies around the world are saying, if we catch you forming cartels under the guise of nominally responding to the crisis, but basically seeking to raise prices, restrict output, we'll apply the law in an aggressive way to you. Second, on price gouging, what about charging too much? A recurring concern at the moment is that individual suppliers are using conditions of scarcity to dramatically raise prices for products and services related to health and safety. Here again, the public agencies are making a couple of announcements. The first is basically the use of publicity and warnings to indicate that competition rules dealing with excessive pricing and a mix of competition and consumer rules dealing with price gouging will be applied vigorously to firms that artificially manipulate supplies, hoard goods or services simply for the purposes of raising price, or otherwise seek to exploit the condition of scarcity in order to raise prices and earn profits in the short term. So one message is to use publicity to discourage that behavior. And a number of authorities are issuing warnings to individual suppliers. That is, we've noticed that your prices have gone up dramatically. We want you to have in mind that these have to be justified in order to support the price you've charged. I think the key issue for firms is to have in mind a specific set of justifications for the price increases. That is, it's necessary in order to restock your inventory, your input prices are going up, but the scenario that will be punished most severely is one in which there's an awareness that a short-term condition of scarcity simply provides an opportunity to make a dramatic profit on a one-time basis. Third, just a word about fraud that our colleagues have mentioned. If you go and look at the guidance document I referred to in the resource room, you see what many competition and consumer authorities are doing globally, which is to encourage individual consumers or other organizations to report fraud. Just about every jurisdiction has a fraud-related hotline. In the DOJ statement and FTC statement about competition law, DOJ included a reminder that said, we have a fraud hotline. Anyone who spots suspicious behavior should use that hotline. And my impression is that agencies around the world are getting lots of reports, some from individual citizens trying to buy a specific product, others from purchasing authorities. These will be very hard to process quickly in the short term, but I'd simply say that over time, and perhaps when the crisis abates, I expect there will be a very careful effort to examine each of these complaints. And I would expect the public authorities to prioritize what appear to be egregious examples of misbehavior and to punish those severely.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Caberna from Easy Buy. I'm here to talk about where the market is as of today and what we're seeing as far as decision-making processes and how we're handling counterfeit goods. Our firm has placed somewhere around $30 million worth of COVID-19 supplies in the last 2 weeks to various state and local entities in the US and the Caribbean. Some very interesting things happened overnight in the market, and I think it's a good example of where we are. So the largest N95 NIOSH approved mask manufacturer in China, a company called Desheng, they had a 200 million mask order placed by a government. We don't know which government it was. We don't believe it was the US government. So overnight pricing for N95 masks went from the high $3 per mask. This is a 79-cent mask normally. It overnight has now gone to the mid fives, so $5.50 per mask. And delivery times went from 5 to 7 days coming out of China to 14 to 21 days coming out of China. We are in the process of trying to get the 10 state governments and large cities we're working with to approve the KN95 mask, which is actually quite a bit more available and less expensive. That's generally a medical decision that in the US, nobody's been willing to make, although internationally we've seen most of the countries we're working with accept KN95 masks. ISO gowns and gloves are two other critical commodities, expensive yet available. So, and the ISO gown gloves have 3 different levels of it. So we're seeing very large orders. We've got a request from the state government for 4 million ISO gowns. So you're going to see that market continue to increase. We think wipes and hand sanitizers, there actually has been success converting breweries and liquor makers to produce hand sanitizer. In the US, they're producing that in bulk, but now the market for dispenser bottles is tightening up. So we were able to secure a large order of those for LA. So they then are having workers actually bottle bulk hand sanitizer. If you can accept iodine hand sanitizer, you're going to be better off, much more readily available. And there's some new technology that makes it theoretically more expensive. But again, medical approvals for iodine-based sanitizer have been slow or non-existent. We actually are identifying sources of ventilators. I'm noticing that the market's not reacting fast. A lot of people are gun shy and probably in some paralysis relative to the counterfeit issues. So we probably have rejected 70% of the orders that vendors have offered based on the fact that we either can't meet payment terms or our clients aren't willing to meet the upfront payment terms, or there's no validation. We do have some major distributors in the US and the Caribbean that are working with escrow agents where dollars are getting transferred to escrow agents, and they have third parties that are investigating and approving the supply before it leaves China, and then releasing the funds through the escrow agent. So that is possible. For the most part, we are identifying suppliers, understanding their terms, and spending significant amount of time on the phone directly with them to determine if their supply is vetted and real. We're asking for photos to be uploaded to our platform. We're seeing the exact same stock photo of an N95 mask from suppliers both in the US, in Europe, and China. So, you know, you are going to have to accept the risk of counterfeit goods in this market. My advice, and going back to what Bill said in the last piece, you must retain and upload your data to some platform. So we are tracking on a daily basis volumes and prices for all these items, so that at the end of this crisis, we are able to go reconcile what our clients and what people paid against what the market actually delivered. We're able to do that on a daily basis. So it's critical that if nothing else, you are able to simply date and timestamp the price you paid and when you're talking to vendors. And I'm hoping everybody on this call has access to e-procurement. I know a lot of people don't. You know, e-procurement is a little less viable because these transactions are only being executed through direct conversations and wire transfers, right? So you have to backfill your e-procurement platform so that data sits, and you have to be thinking about, if this is a counterfeit good, if I'm being price gouged, I'm still going to make this decision. Do I have any ability to take actionable measures at the conclusion of the price crisis? You're going to have to make that assessment live on the phone with a vendor, and then you're going to have to retain that data so that you can audit and compare what you got with what the public was paying at the time. And we're trying to do a massive effort to, anytime we hear a firm price quote from a vendor, we're desperately trying to make sure we're cataloging that information so that there's some basis on being able to audit it later. I see a question about ICU related equipment, syringe infusion pumps, vital sign monitoring. Again, available but expensive, and the requirement, even a non-N95 mask is going to be relatively effective. If we're getting bad ventilators, if we're getting bad syringe pumps, we're in some real trouble, and the market's not going to let you go through the usual channels. We have absolutely seen distributors step in front of guaranteed orders with a suitcase of cash. So I believe that the general market is reacting a little slowly. I think there is opportunity to buy products. If you haven't taken that opportunity, please do it and streamline your decision process. Make sure your medical approvers are in the same virtual room as your finance approvers, so that, if you're taking an hour and a half to make a decision on a product, that product's not going to be there when you call that vendor back. Again, collect your data and remember that the market is changing for the worse on a minute-by-minute basis.
Thanks very much, Ben. Fuguo, Professor Zhao.
Hello, Chris. Yes,
Thank
can you
you.
hear me?
We
Hello?
can hear you, yes.
Yes. And thanks very much, Chris, and congratulations for the number of seminars. And I'm really privileged to be invited here to share with you my view on the fundamental issues of procurement in protecting people's life and health in the current pandemic, indeed. We're not health professional, of course, but I do believe procurement matters, and indeed is critical to protect life and health. And here I have a timeline, the timeline for China, for the development of the virus and the Chinese government intervention, and then the last ones there, the date that China reported zero increase, zero new cases nationally. Roughly, it takes about 2 months, to contain the virus, to have a zero new cases from the very start of government intervention. So we have hope, no panic, and there are hope for the future. But currently we are very mindful for the moment, and there are new import cases and cases of asymptomatic cases, indicating that the virus actually indeed is very deceptive and vicious. So please be guarded, never belittle the situation, and no downplay at all. And my observation is that the government intervention has huge impact, not least on life and health. Quoting a science article saying that it reduced the potential infectious cases by 95%. Right, a huge effective successful intervention. But also, the government intervention, but also, to my view, have a huge impact on the security of procurement supply chain domestically in China and internationally. In the Chinese context, on the one hand, there is the explosive demand for medical supplies, but on the other hand, there is a severe shortage of supply, disruption on production and the supply chain, and worsened by factory shutdowns for holiday. You remember, China shut down only 1 day away from its national holiday. So there's a factory shutdown, the workers all go back home for family reunion or travel across the country or across the globe. There's a shutdown factories and lockdown on production and supply for companies that are still in operation. Suddenly, because due to the shutdown, they are ordered to stop operation, even for the companies that are producing critical medical supplies. The situation changed only in a week when government just say, okay, we need to have more productions of critical medical equipment. So the situation actually is very dire, very, very dire. In terms of the impact on international procurement supply chain, I'm just thinking, let's just envisage a different scenario where China's intervention measures were not effective, and China was still caught in a stage of a dogfight with the virus. And then China would most probably be competing with the other governments for critical medical supply on the global market. And luckily, China is now not a competitor with other governments, but plausibly in a position to supply the other governments by production and supply capacity generated over the last few months under the DAP system. By DAP system, or DAP system literally is a designated exclusive procurement supply system implemented as a public-private joint effort to stimulate production and supply of critical medical supplier for government exclusive purchase, a centralized exclusive purchase. Government provide a huge physical and a financial incentive for the private enterprise to resume, restore the production from holidays, to expand, to convert, to transform production line. There's also government guaranteed purchase of any surplus. Don't worry about just think about the increase of product capability. Never mind nobody will buy it. Government guaranteed purchase supply. So the DAP system is not the government procurement system under the procurement law, but a mechanism granted under the emergency and public health laws. Though in essence, it is a procurement under extreme emergency conditions. So, but where is the procurement law in the emergency procurement? One word: procurement law escaped timely. Very soon after China announced its first level of emergency response, Ministry of Finance issued a notice to grant green pass to virus containment-related procurement, and it is provided in a notice that the methods and the procedures and approval of procurement of imported materials under the GP law and the procurement law may be waived. Arguably, this is based on one of the procurement laws article, which provides that the law shall not be applicable to the emergency procurement due to severe national disasters and other force majeure events. So in China, we have at least double tracks for emergency procurement in China. And it will be very interesting to see what will be the next step for the development of China's emergency procurement system. And our President Xi has already mandated, a considerable legal and regulatory reform in case emergency, public health emergency such days, including the reform and regulations of procurement supply chain. So we will see that. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Foucault. Simon?
Thank you. I will discuss a factor which is aggravating the cross-border supply of critical medical supplies. I will be discussing, in particular, the trade restrictions which we are beginning to see multiplying, in particular on the export side. As we know, with the COVID-19 spreading, demand for medical supplies has far outstripped national production, and as a result, governments are scrambling to acquire the necessary needs. What I would like to show you is 3 pieces of evidence to show you how governments are reacting. Let us start in the top right-hand corner And what we can see here is that since the beginning of the year, there has been an acceleration in the number of export curbs which have been introduced by governments. These export curbs have taken a number of different forms. Some are explicit bans, others are softer, but we can see that as the months have gone by, the export curbs have moved from China westward in line with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see in the most recent days, Latin America now has started adopting export curbs. Now, these export curbs, of course, deny customers in other countries access to critical pieces of medical equipment, medical consumables, and medicines as well. And as a result, they should be thought of perhaps not as beggar thy neighbor, but sicken thy neighbor. To understand the significance of these, look at the panel, please, in the bottom right-hand side, which relates specifically to medical ventilators. In the last year that we have a full set of global trade data, there were just 25 nations that exported more than $10 million of medical ventilators around the world. You can see that they're heavily concentrated in North America, Western Europe, China, and in Australasia. At the moment, we have export restrictions covering ventilators in much of the world. And indeed, you have to ask the question, where are the countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and the CIS region going to acquire ventilators? They may well have local producers, but they're unlikely to be producing at the same technical standard that we have in the higher per capita income countries. And so there are real concerns that this critical piece of medical technology will be denied to people suffering from COVID-19 in the weeks and months ahead. So in a very tangible way, these export bans are beginning to bite, and we have numerous commercial examples of firms which are struggling to be able to source from across the border. So these two charts that I have on the right-hand side relate to export policy. I should also highlight that before the pandemic, there were import barriers to many of the goods which are now in enormous demand. And the World Customs Organization has classified products into different types. And I have on the left-hand side here a chart which relates to protective garments used by frontline medical professionals. It is depressing and true, unfortunately, that 160 nations tax the importation of these protective garments. And we can see that in Latin America and in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, the taxes on those imported garments are rates of 15% or more. These are called so-called tariff peaks in the language of the World Trade Organization. So taxes of this type, of course, are a tax on the health of the medical professionals who are using this equipment. And let us not forget that what the World Health Organization Director General said, which is we cannot fight COVID-19 without health professionals, and they are only able to help their patients if they are well themselves. So evidence of these types of taxation on imported goods, I think are quite frankly shocking. They are part of the reality, and you'll find them in other medical supplies such as soap, disinfectants, and alike. Let me just conclude then with perhaps some good news. We are seeing a number of countries unilaterally lowering their tariffs on imported medical supplies. So to give you two examples, one, Zimbabwe recently announced that it will be lowering its tariffs on the major supplies, and the United Kingdom is lowering not only its tariffs, but also its value-added taxes as well. So countries are taking unilateral action. There are also some countries who are coming together as groups. There is a group of 7 countries led by New Zealand and Singapore. This group includes 2 G20 members who have declared that they will liberalize their trade on these needed medical supplies, and they will refrain from using export restraints. They've also more generally committed to keeping supply chains open. In a world where there is no time really for a global negotiation to fix these problems, these types of bottom-up solutions from governments, either unilaterally or working in groups, are probably the only realistic way of facilitating the cross-border movement of these needed supplies, at least from the trade policy front. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. It was extraordinarily helpful. And as I mentioned before, your report, Tackling COVID-19 Together, is available on the resources page. Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to talk briefly about a section of the CARE Act, which was passed and signed into law by the president last Friday. And I think it's notable because it carried a $2 trillion price tag. One provision in the act addresses the payment to contractors for costs which may not have been included in their original proposal, specifically paid leave. It includes both annual and sick leave. It also includes costs incurred by contractors who, for whatever reason, were unable to access the facility designated in the contract and were unable to perform telework under that contract. It has yet to be implemented in the United States. The fact that Congress passes a statute does not mean that it immediately gets into contracts. Our law requires that the statute then be implemented in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. I know that at the moment, the Department of Defense and GSA, the General Services Administration, are both working feverishly to put out what's called a class deviation to the FAR, which would then authorize and direct the implementation of the provision. Then contractors would in turn have to submit their costs for reimbursement from the government. The idea behind this is to keep the contractors who are on contract with the government alive and well so that they can continue to perform afterwards. I would also share with you that as of last Friday, in the Department of Defense supply base, 33 contractors had been closed, self-closure, most of them for cleaning of the facilities because an infected person or a positive person had been in the facility. A number of them, however, we learned were closed because an engineer who was responsible for supervising production and doing quality control, and they only had one, went out. And when that engineer goes out, the company effectively has to close. I don't think that gets us back on time, Chris, but over to you.
Thanks very much, David. David and I co-teach a course together actually this evening online on procurement reform. And this issue of Section 3610 has been an active source of debate in the class. And I'm tracking it closely on my blog, publicprocurementinternational.com. Benedetta, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you all hear me now?
Yeah, Benedetta has joined us as a special guest. Benedetta is a lawyer at UNOPS. She's located in New York City, and she also co-teaches a course at GW Law School with Jun Jin, who's the Deputy General Counsel at USAID. They teach a seminar on what I would call humanitarian contracting by the World Bank, through USAID, et cetera. So we're very, very glad that she could join us here today to talk about some things that she's seeing as a lawyer at UNOPS.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Eukins. COVID-19 has posed a number of challenges for the UN and UNOPS in particular. Perhaps what I can share is my experience as a member of the Headquarters Contract and Property Committee that makes recommendations for award to the Executive Chief Procurement Officer. What we are observing is that there are, first of all, there is a difficulty to obtain supplies and procure in general. We have observed that there are several new players, And so I can echo the comments that were made earlier about the fact that there are many fraudulent activities which are taking place in this environment. It's very difficult to undertake due diligence on these suppliers, also because there is very little time to procure the goods that are required, especially when we talk about PPE, personal equipment. So there's price increases very quickly. It's very important for procurement officers to take decisions quickly. And so in this environment, we've had cases where vendors were asking for advance payments prior to the delivery of goods. And it was later found that these companies didn't exist at all. Even our long-term agreement holders have found difficulties in honoring the terms of the long-term agreements that we have concluded with them because of the fact that they're not even able to obtain goods from the manufacturers at the same price, which had been secured in the past. So a number of challenges there. The advice that I normally provide to procurement officers in the field is to rely on established relationships with suppliers. So suppliers that you know and you've been working with for a number of years, and be aware of new players in the market that do not have an established track record and could expose the organization to potential fraud. One last comment I wanted to make is that UNOPS has also taken the decision to apply emergency procurement procedures across the organization given the ongoing pandemic.
Sorry, fighting my own mute. Thank you, Benedetta. Thank you very much. We have a question from Vincent Mullo from the African Union, and I want to walk through his question and then open it up to the panelists to respond. So his first question is, what immediate risk can we foresee along the supply chain systems globally that can hinder emergency supply and smooth flow of essential and critical COVID-19 safety and hygiene materials on demand in most public and private hospitals worldwide? And what public procurement methodologies approaches are likely to assist in the speedy process towards COVID-19 mitigation? So to take the question from the back first, as we've been seeing in the chat room, going back and forth in the chat room, and as you've been seeing from the national experiences, clearly the methodology that has to be used is an emergency methodology, just really opening up the procurement process as much as possible because of the variance in the marketplace. Then going back to my conversation with John Luigi before, in terms of tiering the goals and the concerns, clearly the top tier of concerns are quality concerns, clearly quality. And you want to be able to send messages down through the supply chain that those people who are providing poor quality goods will be punished. Those who are providing bad goods that will cause death are going to be punished. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can do it by threatening fraud actions, or you can do it by using, for instance, many systems have now have evolved debarment systems. And what you're seeing then is as the traditional mechanisms of procurement regarding price and responsiveness, as those traditional competitive processes break down, we still maintain the question of contractor qualification. And you can use qualification to try to clear out suppliers, or disqualification, non-qualification, to clear out the suppliers that are posing those types of health risks. So that's one approach. Clear signals regarding fraud prosecution, clear signals regarding potential debarment or exclusion if you're not a qualified supplier because you're providing goods that cause a public health risk. The next tier is price. And as we've discussed in this webinar and the previous webinar, focusing on the question of price, in many ways, if you raise the specter of price gouging, in many ways is going to drive suppliers away from you. So there's real risk in threatening prosecution for price gouging, because the suppliers would simply go someplace else because they don't want to face that risk of that prosecution. Also, looking forward to the next stage, when nations have excess supply and they want to share that excess supply with other nations, as for example in China, as the pandemic recedes in China, and those supplies might be available to other nations, Italy, the United States, wherever. It's going to be politically very difficult for countries to share critical supplies. As long as there's one seriously ill person in the United States, it's going to be politically difficult for the United States to share ventilators elsewhere. However, it will be easy to share money. And so the second stage may be more about funds than about actual supplies. And that means that even though it's very taxing to pay very high prices, governments need to swallow that risk right now, because it'll be easier for them to get additional funds to buy more supplies than it'll be for them to get actual physical supplies, because of the political sensitivities in moving supplies between nations. The lowest tier requirements, and John Luigi was very clear on this, the last thing you want to worry about now is the niceties of procurement rules. There is not time to do that. And I think he was very clear on that. I want to move to the second question about policy interventions and trade flows. And Simon, I wonder if you have some comments on this question of trade policy interventions.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there are several things to say here. First, one has to be extremely careful when sourcing from abroad that the products which are shipped to you are first do not face an export ban or some export authorization requirement, which is opaque in the origin country, or the country where the product is perhaps produced. And then a second factor one has to worry about is if the product is being transshipped through another country, does the transshipping country have restrictions as well, which may result in the product being essentially confiscated and not shipped. So those are two concerns on the export side. What countries can do for themselves, of course, is to review all of their non-tariff barriers as they relate to imported medical supplies. So import licensing requirements, any requirements that firms have to deposit bonds or money in order to cover expected duty payments. And of course, in principle, one should be suspending those import duties and tariffs at the moment. And of course, in some countries, it's not just plain vanilla import tariffs. There are all sorts of other hidden fees which are added on top, the so-called cesses in Southeast Asia, and other taxes which are put on in Latin America and elsewhere on imports. So I think a thorough review of import policy on all of the products is needed as well. Of course, that's not something a procurement agency or an official themselves controls, but a whole of government approach should be thinking about those types of measures as well.
Thank you very much. Simon, can I ask you a question about I know it's unfair because it's a political question. It's not an economic question, but politically, will export controls put in place now make it more difficult to share excess supplies later?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think one calculus you can make is every export ban that a country takes is a political gift to nationalists, economic nationalists in other countries, who then turn around and say, like Mr. Navarro, we can't rely on foreign supplies. We have to do this all here. And so, once you have that type of deterioration in trust, it becomes much harder in a second or a third wave of COVID-19 to support, cooperation between countries then as well. And I think one of the problems we have here is that some countries are not thinking about what happens should this virus recur a couple of times more. We will need to shift. We need to shift medical supplies around the world, and we may find that heavily frustrated by all these different barriers.
Thank you very much. Just quickly to explain for the audience, Simon was referring to Peter Navarro, who's a principal trade advisor in the White House. And what he's referring to is an ongoing debate within the administration as to whether or not additional trade restraints should be put in place during this period. Mr. Navarro has been pushing for those trade restraints, and others in the administration have been opposing for the reasons, in part because of for the reasons that Simon's been pointing out, which is that this is a time of where international cooperation will be absolutely vital. Putting additional trade restraints in place could hurt that international cooperation. With that, we're at the end of our hour. Do we have any further comments from the panelists?
We got a couple of, Chris?
Yes.
A couple of more minutes. I mean, obviously these are, we all put on the table so many points that are, will not get an answer within 2 hours or so. But I think there is a point that I would like to stress once more, and I'm really sorry if, as I mentioned to you privately a week ago, we're in Italy becoming more and more passionate or hysterical about this matter, because we are witnessing really the sort of dramatic fall of what we're trying to build over the past 25 years or so. From an economics perspective, there's something I would like to raise to the attention of Bill for just 1 minute, is the point of really does it make any sense right now to think about the concept of too high a price or price gouging here? You know, when we are facing shortage, especially in the short term, shortage of supply, and there is a lot of unfair competition going on at different levels because of brokers, because of miscoordination. So, I mean, there is simply a huge demand shift rightwards that sort of pushes naturally prices up. So the point is, does it make sense to talk about whether prices have reached sort of unbearable levels, or should we prevent or limit that price going upwards by taking exactly those concrete measures, which are nothing more than coordinated a little bit and trying to sort of lower or soothe a little bit that problem? I worry whether, I mean, there is now, because of competition authorities, they have to do their job. They're just looking into the wrong direction. This is first. So this is a question to Bill. And the second, it's something that, that Chris, I agree with you, the problem of quality. We're talking about the possibility of saving lives. And as I mentioned last week, under supply shortage, what's happening right now in Italian hospitals, which are not necessarily the worst in the world nowadays in terms of quality of care, doctors, they have to decide which particular elderly person is going to survive and which one is going to die within an hour or so. So when it comes to quality, the point is the following. If we need to have more suppliers, and so we need to speed up procedures, at some point we have to loosen up, the network of, the selection, the stage at which we sort of, we evaluate whether or not the potential supplier is fit. And what happens is that we tend to take as many people on board as possible, and then to find out only 3 hours later that some of them are just crooks. And this is what happened to Concept. There was one big bidder, which was nothing more than a former agricultural firm that used to produce fruit juices and turned into a mass producer overnight. So it took us, 3 days to find out that actually that guy was a thief, was a criminal. But in the meanwhile, we sent the signal to health authorities that we were able to provide them with X thousand, X million masks that will never be there. So because of that, we have a conflict, which is really an eternal conflict of sending a positive signal. Yes, because of urgent procurement procedures, we're able to ship you more masks than under usual circumstances. But then we'll find out just a day later that, some of those supplies will never be there because we're losing, a little bit the sort of the filters. And so how to control for quality? And again, this is a point that we raised last time in terms of certification, compliance with international standards, so on, but it's too quick. So there is a temptation on some government side to take anything aboard in order to sort of basically to calm the public down, to say, yes, we have the mask, and then we will find within 2 days that basically 50% is completely a piece of toilet paper, as we normally say in Italy. And I don't have an answer to this, but there is something we're experiencing right now. I don't know whether we're only ones experiencing this, but my suspicion is that we're not alone in this struggle. Thanks. I'm sorry for taking too much time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree with John more. In many of our clients' cases, and I'm talking about large donor organizations, health organizations designed to react to this, we're seeing money available, product being quoted, and the ability to get it delivered. And we're seeing a paralysis because 4 or 5 organizations, someone is dithering about a procurement rule. And I think after watching the effective delivery, the city of Los Angeles has done some really effective things because they just decided to buy first and sort it out later. And unfortunately, the virus and this market doesn't care if you're comfortable with your procurement rules or not. So I think I'm with John on that the consequence of not moving, even if you can't tick all your boxes, is lives, versus a scenario where, you know, for 100 disasters in a row, at the conclusion of the disaster, there's been an audit committee that has discovered price gouging, that has discovered bad acting. Why are we, you know, going to freeze up the supply of ventilators in order to prevent that audit meeting from happening for the 99th time in a row? So in this case, buy your stuff. I have 100 ventilators identified since we've been on this call, and we know 30 countries that needs them. And this is the 3rd time that this vendor has said, hey, we have these ventilators, here's the price, and we can't get anyone to move on them, even though we know people are desperate for ventilators. So don't allow that policy issue to prevent you from getting things you need.
Thank you, Ben. Bill, you want to wrap up, and then we'll have to close it down.
I mean, the larger question is, how do governments give confidence to their population that any of this is working? That is, it's not a question of whether you use a price gouging statute, emergency procurement techniques. It's having a methodology that ultimately will persuade your citizens that you're doing the job, and to give elected officials some confidence in choosing a technique that works. I don't think there's any magic in any specific approach, but how in the face of a severe crisis do you adopt a program that provides a method that seems to your population to be effective, legitimate, accountable? I don't think there's any specific approach that's ideal, but all of these have trade-offs. And if you want to move real quickly and do things right away, you can do that. You can do that. But then you're going to inevitably have the ex post scrutiny that Ben just referred to. You can't avoid that. So either you move real fast, take chances in the short term and get what you need, or you move more deliberately with the health hazards that are provided. But I don't think there's all of these approaches have real costs one way or another, and it's just a matter as a nation, as a collection of jurisdictions, deciding which risks you are most willing to take and to proceed clearly on that basis.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks all to the panelists. Thank you very much to the attendees. We had folks here from 5 continents today, and I'm very glad we had such a complete discussion. Thank you all. Recording of this session will be on the public procurement website, publicprocurementinternational.com. It should be on there within about an hour. It takes me about an hour to process the video. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.